And for anybody, just as you join us, for anybody who's not familiar with our series of research seminars, we run these weekly during the semester of the university. And so if you go to the Centre for Religion in Society blog site at York St John, you'll see a whole list of events there, and you're very welcome to come in person. Some are hybrid, some are online. So keep in touch with us and do pop in every Wednesday. So Luke, you were telling us you had an interesting day.
Yeah, gosh, yeah, we've had some difficult things happening in Luton in this area this week. Very sadly, last Friday, a 16-year-old boy lost his life in a knife attack just around the corner from here, and so there's going to be a peace vigil tonight, which I'm going to, that takes place in the parish, and then I've just had a really interesting afternoon talking. I'm a bricklayer by trade originally, and I went to meet the head of a local school, which is the school where children go when they're excluded from mainstream education here. And we were talking about different opportunities to collaborate, and it's ended up that I'm going to be teaching some bricklaying lessons there, and somehow weaving that in with their religious curriculum. So I'm really looking forward to that.
That's brilliant.
I'll have to get myself some work clothes.
You'll have to dust off your yeah, dust off your hard hat. Just as people are coming in, we haven't started yet. We're just giving folks a couple of minutes to join us. And just to remind you, there is a Q&A button that we'd really encourage you to use throughout. We'll leave some space after Luke's given his presentation, and we'll have a time for questions. And make them hard ones. Luke's really good with hard questions. So we're about 4 o'clock. People may be just coming in as we start. So I would like to thank you very much for joining us, everybody, at this Centre for Religion in Society webinar. This is the second of our series so far this semester. Do join us for future ones, so every Wednesday. And I'd like to introduce you to Father Luke Larner. And I've been chatting quite a lot with Luke. He's got some really interesting things to say about class, about solidarity, about church, and hopefully we'll be talking about vicars going on strike a bit later. But just to show you, he's the editor of this book, which is called Confounding the Mighty. There's some incredibly deep, interesting, and fairly novel ideas written by the contributors in this, and Luke's going to sort of navigate us through some of that material. So I'm here to welcome you, Luke, and to offer the floor to you now. I know you've got a presentation you want to share with us. So Luke will speak for about 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to invite questions. So over to you, Luke.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and it really is a pleasure to be with you all today. It's a special day for me today. It's the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, and I'm a tertiary Franciscan, and I've had a day full of some fun and other tricky but worthwhile things, and I include this as being a very fun and worthwhile thing, so thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, and I'm going to talk a little bit about both the introduction, but particularly the conclusion, and expand a bit on some of the ideas within that. And then we'll have some time for questions. So I will jump straight into that. Over the last 3 years or so, the word solidarity is one that's grown increasingly important to me. That comes from all kinds of different experiences, such as singing it across the fence at an immigration detention centre, to local trades union mobilisation and real living wage campaigns, and academic settings like this where we get to pontificate about these sorts of terms. Former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, describes solidarity as recognizing shared interest and undertaking shared risk. It's not an abstract or an ethical ought to, but rather it's something that exists within the very charter of our humanity. Solidarity is part of what it means to be human, in his words, to protest against those forces that challenge and oppose a mutuality already given by God. From a Christian perspective, in our creatureliness, we're bound together in solidarity. So in this post-lockdown, cost of living, hostile environment world we inhabit, I think there's real power in the notion that solidarity is both inherently God-given and inherently human. It's not something that we can simply drum up. It's a lot deeper than that. As Williams observes, despite the general acceptance that nobody was safe until everybody was safe during the height of the COVID pandemic, many fail to recognise that that applies to our economic as much as our medical well-being. Professor Jurg from Vanderbilt University, he recognises, however, that history teaches us that deep solidarity usually emerges not as the result just of progressive ideas, but because people realised their shared interests, came together and organised. As I say, this paper revises and expands upon the concluding chapter in my recent edited volume, Confounding the Mighty. While drawing inspiration from the praxis, theory and theology of a variety of liberation struggles, in this paper, my main focus is going to be the broader category of class struggle and how it relates to other categories such as post and decolonialism, gender and racial justice, and many others. And here, drawing from Jurg Rieger's work, I'm suggesting that social class, particularly under late-stage capitalism, is primarily a set of materially unequal economic and labour relationships, and the socio-cultural institutions and frameworks which reproduce those unequal economic and labour relationships. Class struggle is, in this sense, the fight of the labouring majorities of the world for fair wages, fair conditions, and a fair share of the world's resources and means of production. And I'm including reproductive labour and the labour of non-human life within that too, of course. Some people might critique that focus on class, this whole approach, as being quite reductionist. But I want to join others in making a claim for the return to a focus on social class, particularly in theologies of liberation, which it very often feels that that focus on class and material analysis has been lost. Ivan Petrella recognised this in his excellent 2008 book, Beyond Liberation Theology. Petrella rightly recognises that liberation theologies have lost some of their focus on the material circumstances and challenges of the working classes across the world. And he thinks that's because, and I quote, the upsurge of race, ethnicity, gender and sexuality as organising axes for liberation theology has blurred the fact that material deprivation, that is the deprivation that comes from one's class standing in society, remains, in his words, the most important form of oppression. Now, I would say he is in danger of becoming a bit reductionist here. But the analysis of material conditions, of course, has a very specific relationship with class alongside ethnicity and gender. So I wouldn't want to try and separate these categories anymore. But I do think that class creates a particular danger and precarity among these other categories as well. You know, the experiences of all people of majority world heritage will not be the same depending on their class and other statuses. And I'm going to go deeper into this in a moment. Secondly, I want to urge for a return to a sense of vocation to praxis among liberation theologians, and in fact all theologians, whether they're Christian or not. As Gustavo Gutierrez famously wrote, paraphrasing Karl Marx, theology is properly understood as the second act after our praxis. It's the second act after the involvement in practical liberation struggles. And as Cornel West observes, without a grounding in praxis, and I quote, critical consciousness becomes as sounding brass and theological reflection a tinkling cymbal. I wrote these words on the birthday of Chairman Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party, who you'll see there behind me, who had a remarkable gift for organising solidarity between diverse working class groups such as the Black Panther Party, Appalachians, the Latin Kings and others. And in his words, and I quote, "It is a class struggle, God damn it." I'm going to look at particularly the last chapter of the book with a few bits from elsewhere through these three categories and really want to focus on some of the practical applications of what this might mean and what I argue. Firstly, the first part of that argument, I look at Christian theologies of the Holy Spirit in three moves. And the first move is to look at the orthodox theology of theosis and what I call mass movements. In the book, in the first chapter, I critique shallow theological approaches to social class, which tend to focus on the inclusion of working class people in church membership and church leadership, without an intersectional critique of economic, political and labour relationships. And I call that feckless faith. The etymological root of the word feckless comes essentially from the word effect. So to be feckless means to be without effect, to be useless. It's a sort of insult often said with a smirk of mockery. So if I was to ask you to think of a powerful English politician in recent history using the words drunk, criminal, aimless, feckless and hopeless, I wonder who might immediately come to mind. If your answer to that question was Boris Johnson, then you're half right. But these words, drunk, criminal, aimless, feckless and hopeless, weren't written about Boris Johnson, they were written by Boris Johnson. In 1995, he wrote an article saying that British working class men are drunk, criminal, aimless, feckless and hopeless, and claim low self-esteem brought on by unemployment. I find that last comment particularly ironic given his own employment history in recent years. In 2020, Boris Johnson commissioned a report investigating why white working class boys, in his words, were falling behind their peers in school and being let down by the system. So why this sudden change from being a mocker of the working class to being an advocate for the so-called white working class? This government report claimed that the use of the term white privilege has contributed towards a systemic neglect of white people facing hardship. That's from the Education Committee in 2021. They describe in this report white privilege as a politically controversial terminology. And the report even goes as far as to suggest that schools who use it fall short of their duties under the Equality Act. So really this report was a thinly veiled threat inhibiting how schools go about addressing racism. Boris's actions here, I think, might help us understand wider trends in class discourse by exemplifying a lack of intersectional perspective on class and the use of the white working classes as pawns in a political game. The other source of this feckless faith idea comes from a book called Reckless Faith by the American evangelical John MacArthur. The theme of his book, Reckless Faith, is discernment, which I find highly ironic given the fact that he is the famous evangelical leader who said any real Christian will vote for Donald Trump. These feckless approaches to class and to faith demonstrate the two types of theological discourse on class that I critique in more detail in the first chapter. The first type of theological discourse around class is a sort of whataboutery, which tries to shut down conversations about decolonising, gender equality, LGBTQ plus inclusion, and other types of conversations by saying, but what about the white working class? As if social class is not already directly related to those above categories, particularly in the case of decolonising. The global proletariat, of course, are one of the most diverse groups of people on planet Earth. My view is that this type of white working class whataboutery is often used for personal gain rather than for a real concern for class justice. There's usually an ulterior motive behind that kind of a discourse. The second type of discourse is either, why aren't there more working class people in church? To which I would usually respond, go visit your local Pentecostal church and you'll probably find a whole load of working class people. Or was it only white working class people that you were looking for? Slightly more progressive than that perspective would be a push for more working class representation among church leadership. And while that is a valuable pursuit, I mean, I wouldn't be sitting here as a church leader myself had that not been the case. I think it's still a failure to grapple with class as a justice issue, to grapple with class justice and class struggle as broader theological topics and areas for praxis in faith communities. So as Victoria Turner, one of my colleagues and contributors to the book, describes, by trying to engage with class and associated issues like economic exploitation and marginalisation under capitalism, what we're trying to do, what we're desiring in this piece of work is deep theological, ecclesiological and missiological reflection on these issues. Being an Anglican in the Catholic tradition, the celebration of the Eucharist is absolutely central to my faith, spirituality and practice. So to pivot a bit more to a slightly different topic here, to me, the Eucharist is a sacrament. It's an outward and visible sign of an inward and invisible grace, in St. Augustine's words. It's a visible and physical means of transformation. In his chapter in the book, Rajiv Sidhu describes how his understanding of class and solidarity and caste are impacted by the preparatory prayer used at the mixing of the water and the wine, which says, Christ humbled himself to share in our humanity. Our common humanity, as Williams described, exists within its givenness, and God participates in this solidarity in the incarnation of Christ. So I believe that we're celebrating and indeed participating in this when we share in that Eucharistic feast. Tim Gorringe describes how, and I quote, when the whole human race is living the life symbolized in the Mass or the Eucharist, living in comradeship and equality, sharing all the material things of the world and all the joys of life in common, then the whole world will be seen to be the very body and blood of God. Thus the Mass is both the foretaste of the divine commonwealth, which is the true natural human life, and a means for bringing it about. Gorringe goes on to highlight the association between the Eucharist, solidarity and class struggle through the words of a sign which some radical Anglo-Catholic parishes used to place by the reserved sacrament in their churches. So it's our practice to reserve some of the consecrated bread and sometimes wine. And part of my role as a parish priest will be to go and visit the sick at home or in hospital and share the communion that we celebrated at church with them. So the sign says this: unless you are revolutionary against the present evil world which denies the bread of life to those who produce it, and unless you fight for the common bread for the common people, you must not dare approach this holy sacrament. To me, these words imply that to deny divine investment in class struggle is actually to fail to understand the nature of what communion is. It's a denial, really, I think, of the transformative work of the Holy Spirit. In Eastern Orthodoxy, the epiclesis, which is where the Holy Spirit is invoked over the bread and wine in the Eucharist, in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, that is the moment when Christ is thought to become mysteriously present in the Eucharistic elements of bread and wine. Russian Orthodox theologian Bulgakov argued that the Spirit's transforming work in the Eucharist is continued as the Spirit is invoked to transform God's people, raising them through Christ into the life of God, just as the bread and wine are raised during the consecration. Bulgakov saw the post-Pentecost work of the Spirit as invisibly transfiguring the world and the human race. For the Holy Spirit inspires humanity, thereby taking part in its history. So if we recognize that the Spirit raises human society into the kind of communion or koinonia represented by the Lord's Supper, and if we acknowledge that the same Spirit inflamed the hearts of the prophets who raged against the oppression of the poor, we might conclude that the empowerment of class struggle and eradication of unjust class structures is part of the mission of the Holy Spirit. This understanding has profoundly impacted my own experience, both of partaking in and celebrating the Lord's Supper. I ask, if the Spirit is at work in the transfiguring of human beings and the world, will she maintain the existing class structures which depend on the exploitation of the proletariat and indeed the planet we live on, that enable continued wage theft from the labouring majority by the wealthy, that maintain undemocratic labour relations which leave the means of production in the hands of the few? No, for me, that is the antithesis of what we are celebrating when we gather around the Lord's table as Christians. For as it says in 2 Corinthians, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So we might recognise class movements which lead us towards a global sense of koinonia or communion as mass movements in the Eucharistic sense. They are a sign and foretaste of where the Spirit is leading us and a means of getting us there. Ruth Harley uses the wilderness metaphor in her chapter. It's characteristic of the Spirit to lead God's people through the wilderness. The Spirit led Jesus to the wilderness after his baptism to test his resistance to the temptation of grasping earthly power and wealth, just as the Spirit led God's people through the wilderness in the Exodus narrative. Through Exodus, we are delivered by the Spirit into liberation and the emancipation that comes through Jubilee. The Exodus narrative, of course, we should know, actually begins in the context of labour exploitation, and it leads to jubilees of justice, the redistribution of land, and access to the means of production. Liberation theologian Jorge Pixley recognises a resonance with mass movements wherever the text of Exodus is read by anyone sensitive to what God wants to do today in the liberation of oppressed individuals and peoples. Now, I'm conscious there's some potential weaknesses in that perspective related to the Holy Land, but we can get onto that in our discussions later. Next, I go on to talk about the role of prophets in the biblical tradition, prophets who the Nicene Creed says the Spirit speaks through the prophets. And I outline the fact that prophets in the Old Testament, at least, speak specifically about the journey from the world as it is to the world as it should be through a really clear material analysis, through the analysis of economic and labour relationships, as well as religious life. And Selina Stone does some great work in her chapter looking at the early Pentecostal movement as a prophetic challenge to established churches like the Church of England, in recognising the Spirit's calling and equipping of all people, regardless of class, race, or gender. I don't have time at this point to go into that section any further, but I think it is an important area to look at. The third part, one of the mottos from the field of working class studies as an academic discipline is we gather not to mourn, but to organise. Organising is a relational approach to the journey from the world as it is to the world as it should be. And this happens through people coming together to build diverse people power, to join together in the kind of mass movements of solidarity and quests for liberation that I've described, to raise up leaders and prophets who can take us through the wilderness and take action to move power holders and decision makers towards the common good. A key understanding from pneumatology is that the work of the Spirit is to transform relationships and foster deeper relationality. In his classic book on the Spirit, the former missionary and Anglican bishop John V. Taylor refers to the Holy Spirit as the go-between God, recognising the Spirit's ministry as having both interpersonal, socio-economic and political implications in the service we can render together to the world. I would want to add to what John Taylor says a clearer emphasis on the transformation of classed relationships towards a classless society, believing as I do that the Spirit of God is at work among movements of solidarity, which lead our world towards a brighter future. Organising for change means a transformation of how people relate to one another, non-human life and the rest of creation, through spirited interruptions, as Amaya Jones Armstrong puts it, which bind us together in the kind of koinonia we see in Acts chapter 2, where people held all things in common. If the Spirit transforms the way people relate to one another and to God, what are the implications for our understanding of the Church's mission? There has been a discernible turn towards theologies of the Holy Spirit in global theologies of the last century, and that includes the Roman Catholic theology of religions post-Vatican II, the theologies which accompanied the civil rights movement in the USA and elsewhere, and even, God forbid, in the Church of England. Pentecostal theologian Amos Young argues that from the post-Pentecost perspective of Acts chapter 2 from the New Testament, the Missio Spiritus emphasises the socio-economic domain. This transformation of socio-economic relationships isn't just limited to those early Christians who had all things in common and redistributed their wealth, according to Acts chapter 2, but rather these transformed relationships reflect the wider biblical tradition of care for the alien and the stranger, and of seeking the welfare of the city where you live. Young sees the Spirit's mission as the interrelational work of the divine life that creates, sustains, and redeems the world, and in that respect interfaces with others at and beyond the so-called borders of the believing community. The socio-economic and the political here are intertwined, lending a political element to this idea of a Missio Spiritus, both in the local and the international. Interfaith solidarity through the Spirit then becomes essential. According to Young, the Spirit's witness to planetary justice helps us reimagine our relationships of solidarity and to organise for change with allies of all faiths and none. I think it is a feckless faith indeed, which cannot adequately engage with religiously plural post-colonial contexts. As Sri Lankan liberation theologian Aloysius Pieris recognises, the majority of God's poor, as he puts it, belong to religions other than Christianity, not only in Pieris's context in Sri Lanka, but even in my own parish, where around 80% of the population are Muslim. With this in mind, Pieris argues a theology that does not speak to or speak through this non-Christian peoplehood is an esoteric luxury of a Christian minority. A turn to the Spirit and the praxis of liberation have, in my own experiences, fostered mutually fulfilling and transformative relationships with people of other faiths. These more recent turns to the Spirit have an older and very enigmatic counterpart in the relationship between revolutionary politics and the visions of a 12th century abbot called Joachim of Fiore. Catherine Keller points to this history of Joachim's vision of an age of the Spirit, where all goods would be held communally, as she puts it, the agapic communism of the first generation of Christians. Fiore's legacy is very nuanced, and his original writings show little in the way of revolutionary drive. But as we all know, ideas have a habit of forming lives of their own. As Matthias Reidel demonstrates in his excellent essay on Fior, the development of the revolutionary idea of a third age, an uprising of the underprivileged against the ruling classes, ecclesiastical as well as secular, can be traced from Fior, and rather special to today for me as a Franciscan, via radical Franciscanism, all the way through, amazingly, to the key thinkers of modern communism, including Friedrich Engels. I should offer a note of caution here, because both extreme left and extreme right-wing movements of the 20th century took at least some inspiration from the imaginary and terminology of Fior, including the Nazis' conception of a Third Reich. That was actually taken from Fior's idea of a third age, but it's a lot more loosely and with less historical development than in the case of communism, which really took this kind of uprising against the ruling classes of the underprivileged. With this in mind, I think where love and solidarity cease to be at the centre, we need to be very careful of these utopian third age dreams of the spirit, which can easily descend into totalitarian nightmares, whether they are on the left or the right. Discernment then becomes a key priority. In conclusion, then, how might Christians respond to our present dilemmas and these radical theologies of the spirit? In the book, we explore education, urban ministry, and particularly the critique of labour relationships. In my own practice, I've addressed these challenges through broad-based community organising, living wage campaigns, participation in the trades union movement, including the organising of faith workers themselves into unions. As Riga suggests, as the power of capital grows and is consolidated into a shrinking group of elites known as the 1%, the 99% working and middle classes have a growing need to build solidarity and organise with each other. And just before we close, it's important to note the acceleration of innovation through technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning and robotics, which is likely to accelerate and hasten this trend that Riga describes, and is what some people are calling a fourth industrial revolution. Catherine Keller points to the negative impact that this will probably have on the labouring masses in her apocalyptic dream reading of the very near future. These challenges need addressing through further real theological reflection, which is beyond the scope of this paper. However, I believe an intersectional and a materialist class analysis must be a high priority in these theological reflections, given that the fourth industrial revolution can shift even more power from labour towards capital and increase the levels of precariousness beyond those already experienced. While I did a lot of research on this as I wrote this chapter, and it was interesting that while they're not always overtly critical of capitalist economics, a lot of the contemporary commentators and futurists seem to agree on this risk that these technological innovations pose specifically to proletariat workers. This then raises the challenge for a new generation of liberation theologies which at once reclaim an even greater emphasis on class and material conditions, while being ready for the shifts to the world of labour created by the fourth industrial revolution, shifts which are already a long way down the tracks. A generation which also has a renewed emphasis on the vocation to liberatory praxis among liberation theologians. If we're to believe that the Spirit's freedom means something more than personal piety and can answer the challenges of the ghost in the neoliberal machine, Christians must find practical ways to discern and to join in the liberation work of the Missio Spiritus today. I agree wholeheartedly with Jörg Riga that the organic work of movement and community organising becomes one of the most genuine expressions of the faith of religious communities, and therefore key to the work of theology and indeed mission in what he calls the Capitolocene. That is the end of the paper, so we can go into some discussion.
Thanks so much, Luke. There's a lot there for people to process, so I'm just going to be really cheeky and grab the first question, mainly because you talked about organising and solidarity, and we've sort of enticed people along by in the title talking about vicars being on strike. So can I just ask you to unpack that? What is happening at the moment? What are unions getting involved with the church, and how's that going down with the institutional church?
So I'm part of Unite's faith workers branch within Unite the Union, and we have a particular kind of Anglican grouping within that called Seeker, Church of England Employee and Clergy Advocates, which is open to anybody employed in the Church of England, whether they are clergy or not. One of the complicated things about being a parish priest is that technically you're not an employee, you're an office holder, which means you're not actually protected by employment law, which can be quite challenging. So it is an interesting context to be doing union organising, and it's something that I'm quite new to in this particular area. One of the things that we're looking at is the very typical things you'd see in union organising, which is pay and conditions, pay and working conditions. Now, I have no qualms about the rough level of pay which clergy receive. We're not actually paid, we're given a stipend, which is meant to cover our living. I'm only on a half stipend because I'm doing my PhD as well part-time. But clergy stipend haven't matched inflation at all in recent years, despite the fact that the Church of England's church commissioners sit on this £10 billion fund, which is averaging a 10% return over the last 30 years. So at the moment, we're talking about £1 billion a year. The entire bill for stipendiary clergy is 250 million a year, which is a quarter of that annual return. So for me, the fact that they're not even agreeing to match inflation, I don't think any of us are asking for a pay rise. We're just asking to not have pay cuts. The other side of it, when we talk about conditions, many clergy work insane hours because they're given 5 or 6 parishes to look after and are working. We're expected to work 6 days a week under our common tenure, which is sort of our contract, which obviously has a major impact on family life because a lot of it is evenings and weekends as well as working during the day. So we're wanting to do some work around the conditions in which people are working, which includes days off, but also Rosa Luxemburg theorised at the turn of the last century that there would be a general proletarianisation of a lot of typically middle-class professions. And I think academics is one classic example of that, where academics are working on 0 hours contracts, they're having short-term contracts, they're essentially having their labour become a lot more precarious. In a far less way to what we're seeing among academics, there has actually been a bit of a move to that, I think, among clergy. So more and more clergy are becoming priest in charge rather than vicar, which takes away a level of permanence of the post. There are more and more part-time posts. There are more and more time-limited posts. There are more and more parishes being amalgamated into one with one leader. So some of that work conditions, stress levels, well-being stuff is part of what we're wanting to organise around. As for what the church thinks about it, I mean, I don't know if the church really knows what a union is and what it's for. Back in the day when the Bishop of Durham supported the Welsh miners' strike, I think we were in a bit of a different place than where we are today. So I don't know that there's, I mean, I was told in the early days of training, don't join the union because it's, and I quote, career suicide. I don't really feel that that's the case anymore necessarily. I mean, there are bishops who belong to the union, which creates some interesting challenges. So, yeah, I think it's a really fascinating thing to see how all this, whether we'll go on strike. A lot of us have talked about, well, if a general strike is called, for example, I know there's a lot of noise about that last year, would we go out on strike? I mean, I have a firm commitment not to cross a picket line as one of my core ethical values. So, you know, we've talked about, well, what would going on strike look like? Because I wouldn't want my parishioners to suffer. So, I mean, the kinds of strikes that academics have done, like marking strikes, we'd maybe look at that kind of a model where it's not an all-out walkout, but yeah, I don't know. That could be interesting. Not that it's being seriously discussed at this stage, I don't think. But yeah, those are the kind of conversations that have been taking place in bars behind closed doors, I think.
Thanks, Luke. If that ever happens, we will definitely get you back to talk us through what's happening there. I'm going to go to a question raised by Esther, because it leads on from what you've just said. So Esther says, great presentation, thanks. Fundamentally agree that we need an intersectional approach to solidarity and industrial action. During COVID, there was a negative reaction to the government's labelling church as leisure activity, with various priests arguing that there were frontline workers doing funerals and pastoral care, etc. But the current government is trying to prevent frontline workers from striking at all, so via minimum service legislation. Might this have a negative impact on clergy wanting to strike in the same sorts of ways?
I think when we get into these kind of arenas, whether we're talking about the church institutions or the government, these sorts of things I think tend to be more of a cock-up than a conspiracy. So I think the handling of this stuff during the lockdowns, I don't know that it was intentional for clergy, it was just not very well handled. Certainly we weren't prevented from doing things like funerals once things had kind of settled down a bit and they started figuring it out. The only, I mean, even food banks and stuff like that, we weren't prevented for. It really was only church in-person services that we were stopping. Not to minimise that, because that is a very difficult thing. Yeah, in terms of the future and the stopping of frontline, I mean, realistically, are we going to still have this government in a few months, in a year's time? Probably not. So I'd be surprised. I don't know. I don't think it'll affect clergy. I think the onus on us really is to be in solidarity with other workers, and to show the fact that it's been mentioned at the Conservative conference that the church needs to keep its nose out tells me that some people must be doing their job properly in the church at the moment.
Apologies for the hiatus there. My mute button is stuck. Thank you very much for that, Luke. Again, I think this could run and run as a discussion. I'm sure we'll pick this up with you another time. David says, wonderful talk, thank you. I wonder if Luke could say something about the difference between solidarity and love for your neighbour.
My very short answer to that would be there shouldn't be a difference. As Cornel West says, justice is what love looks like in public. So solidarity should, to me, the kind of theological notion of agape love should really be rooted in something that looks like solidarity. The reason I use the term solidarity rather than just the term love is it can be quite easy just to kind of spirit away love. I mean, in fact, there's plenty in the biblical narratives on this. My mind's a bit hazy today, but I think it's in the first epistle of John, where it talks about love not in words but in deeds. But I think the word solidarity sort of conjures up a sense of shared suffering in a way that just to talk about love doesn't necessarily do. It kind of brings in some of that material analysis that I'm talking about.
Yeah, thanks for that, Luke. And so Ruth asks, can you say a bit more about how an emphasis on solidarity, mass movements and organising might offer a theological critique of individualistic narratives of personal transformation? This is interesting, isn't it? Including individualistic understandings of salvation. Is there a soteriological significance of an emphasis on class struggle?
Absolutely. I mean, and that is really one of the things I'm trying to do in that last chapter, but also in my doctoral work, is to address this kind of individualistic approach to the spirit, which becomes nothing more than kind of pie in the sky when you die, to use the words of an old trade union song. So it is to say that when we really dig into the Old and New Testament narratives and talk about the spirit from an Old Testament perspective, you're getting into some slightly tricky ground there, but there is a very both material and communal dimension to what the Spirit seems to do, which really goes against this kind of Western individualist perspective, which leads to a very individualized faith. There's a very material relationship that comes with the Spirit. And then particularly in the Eastern Orthodox theologies, this idea of theosis, that the work of the Spirit is lifting not just humans, but all creation being lifted up by the Spirit into the Trinitarian relationships in the Godhead. Is this idea we're being lifted up into a relationship, into the God relationship, the perichoretic dance, to use one term. So I think it is to say, I don't think, I use words like orthodoxy carefully, given that I'm decidedly unorthodox in a lot of my beliefs, but it is actually an aberration to have this very individualistic approach to salvation, and yet the church is so rife with me and my personal Jesus, which the revolutionary Jesus of Nazareth would have found anathema to what he was about.
Yeah, that's such an important question. So thanks for asking that, Ruth. Naomi says, "Hi Luke, really interesting talk. I'm really interested in the Catholic Crusaders sign you mentioned that is placed over the Blessed Sacrament. While I agree that the Eucharist is inherently political, I also know that not everyone can experience this in the Eucharist. Would you say that you believe that the Eucharist should only be seen as a political act?"
I would say categorical no to that. I don't believe it is an only political act, with the caveat that it entirely depends what you mean by political and politics. So, this word politics and even the word religion are becoming really tricky. I'm trying to get some funding for a community project here at the moment, and anything which promotes religion or politics is barred from receiving this funding. And I'm a bit like, well, religion and politics is just human life, isn't it? Anywhere where there are humans, there is religion and there is politics. So, this kind of strange nervousness around the word politics is a funny one. The best definition I've heard is it comes from two Latin base works, poly, which means many, and ticks, which means blood-sucking insects. But more seriously, no, for me, fundamentally, to be faithful to Jesus of Nazareth is not to make him out to be a secular revolutionary who had a religion narrative attached to him. Within the Hebrew tradition, the religious, and I'm going to use the term civic rather than political, but the religious and civic life of God's people are completely intertwined. They are not two separate categories. So for me, I don't think nothing spiritual is happening in the Eucharist, despite being very, very materialist in my outlook on life. There is something about what a sacrament is. As I said earlier, a sacrament is a means of grace, and it is an outward symbol of an invisible transformation. So there is something happening. God is doing something mysterious that I can't put into words as we celebrate and share that ritual of meaning making together in the Eucharist. I do not think it is just a artistic performance, it is an artistic performance, but it's not just an artistic performance. It is a piece of poetry, but it's not just a piece of poetry. It is a radical act, but it's not just a radical act. It's interesting you mentioned the Catholic Crusaders. What a terrible name for an organisation that was. They called it, I think, the Catholic Crusade for communism, and like a lot of those words became very problematic. Hence the movement kind of died. But I use that point to emphasise that place in the church where the sacrament is reserved for those who aren't of a more Catholic tradition. That is sort of the Holy of Holies, really. So in my church, as in many others, we have a sort of a little holy cupboard where the reserved sacrament is kept, and we have a candle that is always burning, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There is a candle burning. And after, without going into details, a fairly harrowing pastoral encounter relating to injustice earlier this week, all I could do was just sort of be in the dark of the church and look at that little flickering light in the darkness for a minute, and didn't really have any other words or things that I felt I could do. I just had to sit and look at it. So it is a very significant thing to place this sign, to say, to really participate in this thing, you have to have this sense of shared struggle. Now, I wouldn't go refusing anybody the sacrament if they didn't, pledge their allegiance to Karl Marx, because I operate a relatively open table policy for communion. But I think it underlines something of the seriousness of how people took this.
Thanks, Ruth. And Ruth, another Ruth is asking, is there a bit of tension between the parish system and solidarity, parish system of the Church of England, as divide and rule and ploughing your own furrow seem institutionalised habits?
So yes, I think there is a tension between the hierarchy in the Church of England. I wouldn't say there's necessarily a tension in terms of the concept of a parish as a geographic area. In my politics, I probably lean towards something like anarcho-syndicalism. And out of Catholic social teaching, I love the term subsidiarity within Catholic social teaching. And that's very mainstream Catholic social teaching. And subsidiarity is partly this idea that decisions should be made on as local a basis as possible. So I think the idea of sort of having a sense of belonging within a certain area without making those violent types of boundaries can actually be quite conducive to, because otherwise it just becomes impossible to manage, right? And the opposite of that would be a centralization of power. So I would say it's the hierarchy and the lack of democracy and transparency in how all the lines are drawn and who is appointed and all of that stuff, and who is appointed to senior decision-making positions. To me, that is the bigger challenge to solidarity, because it is not a relational use of power, it is very much a hierarchical use of power. And of course, the church is deeply wedded to the class relationships within the UK.
Thanks for that. And Mark is asking, what would you say to those who regard liberation theology as a failed project?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there has been that narrative given. I was at a conference in Bangkok a couple of weeks ago where of sort of radical, it's called Discernment and Radical Engagement. And we were really wanting to revisit liberation theologies. And a lot of people were drawing from these historic liberation theologies. I would say it's not failed yet. I mean, you could describe the church as a failed project, but we are in the early church just now, given the age of this planet and the age of this universe. You know, this is the early church. So to call a project failed after such a short period of time, I think would be to overemphasize it. I think it needs to evolve. And all these semantics of these terms, I mean, we talk about liberation theology. Well, should not all theology be liberative? So therefore, what's the opposite of liberation? Do we not just have theology and then colonizing theology and oppressive theology, you know? So, yeah, I wouldn't agree it's failed yet, but there are problems.
And Bailey's asking, do you not fear that a rise in stipend will result in more churches merging into one, placing more pressure on clergy and lay staff?
That's the kind of narrative that I have heard. Let's do that material analysis here. The Church Commissioners Fund is £10 billion, or their whole kind of shebang equates to £10 billion at the moment, and they've been averaging a 10% return over the last 30 years. So we're talking about £1 billion a year. You could cover the entire stipend cost as it stands predicted for this year with a quarter of the annual return. There is absolutely no shortage of funding for parish ministry in the Church of England. That is a lie. There is no need to be cutting posts. It is clearly driven by some, I don't want to go down the kind of save the parish conspiracy theory stuff because I'm not interested in that. And I think it's the kind of post-imperial melancholia within that whole project that I'm very allergic to. However, the actual financial reason is not a reason. You know, the move towards parish ministry working on the basis of giving within that parish is a recent innovation. That fund largely was set up to ensure that people working in parishes like mine could have a sustainable ministry. You know, in a parish like mine, hence why I'm on a 0.5 post, they couldn't afford a full-time priest. So no, I don't believe this. This is kind of part of a wider narrative sometimes that, you know, won't lifting wages lead to inflation and make goods more expensive? No, it won't. You know, I don't think any sensible economist would agree that that's the case, given that the flow of wealth is going upstream to an increasing exponential degree over the last 100 years. The wage gap between the top 1% and the top 0.1% and the everyday worker is insane that we put up with this. There's the whole thing about Elon Musk, and he's told the UN, if you can prove that we could combat world poverty with $6 billion, I'll write you a check tomorrow. So they did. And what did he do? He donated it to his own charitable foundation as a tax avoidance measure. These people, they're crooks. There's a great book come out. I haven't read it yet. I'm obsessed with the title, which is All Riches Come from Injustice. And I couldn't agree more. It's fundamentally unjust, this situation that we are in.
Thanks for asking that, Bailey, because that is probably something that applies to a lot of industries and sectors who are engaged in industrial action at the moment, that need to kind of combat some of those common discourses. So thanks for asking that. Richard is saying, hi, Luke, thanks for the presentation. The Bible says a lot about rich and poor and their relations. Do we really need the category of class in theology?
I would argue a strong yes to that. Rich and poor are words in the English language. And I think to really do the kind of analysis that you're seeing, particularly in the Old Testament prophets, our nearest equivalent to talk about in our language would be social class. Obviously, society is completely different. The economic models that we are working on now in a late capitalist society are completely different to the kind of economies and labour relationships that existed 2,500 years ago. So when I talk about class, I'm talking about class largely using Marxist analysis, at which point some people start freaking out about why am I, as a priest or a theologian, using Marxist analysis. Well, when I need to change the oil filter in my car, the best place I can go to know how to do that is the Haynes manual, because it's a good tool. And I personally find Marxism a good tool to do analysis about the rich and the poor under late capitalism, which explains why there are rich and poor. What was it? Dom Helder Camara, was it, who said, I feed the poor and they call me a saint. I ask why they are poor and they call me a communist. That is because in asking why are people poor, we are getting into class analysis. And that is really the only way in late capitalism that we can understand why people are poor is through class analysis.
And David is asking a question. Great question. David's asking a question that I wanted to ask, and we've got 4 minutes. And this is quite a complex question, but postmodern theorists such as Pakulski and Waters, 1996, declared class as dead because they said material inequality no longer gives rise to class or provides an adequate explanation for modern society. I think it is very clear that there is still a strong subjective sense of class identity still in most societies. I resonate with that. But it does seem to be more complex than employment, material wealth, and includes education, access to power, etc. Here it comes. What objective definition of working class are you working with? And how does it work across humanity, i.e. a working class person in the UK compared to one in the Philippines? What do they have in common? And you've got...
That's great. A really good place for us to end there, I think. Yeah, there's a really good place for us to end. Really good question. So the definition of class I'm working with is that class under late stage capitalism, as I said earlier, is a set of materially unequal economic and labour relationships and this is the key point, and the socio-cultural frameworks and institutions which reproduce these unequal relationships. So it's not just, class is not just a matter of how much money you have in your bank account, whether you own your own home. There's all kinds of other aspects to it. There is education, there's culture stuff within the mix there that all helps reproduce these class relationships. I would agree. I mean, I think the postmodern theorists here are being very counter-revolutionary and often are speaking from a position of great privilege when they say this. Hence why I find it frustrating when some conservative theologians will lump liberation and postmodern into the same category when they're clearly not. I would say it is a very, very complex set of relationships, class. So it's quite tricky to talk about, as you put, a person in the Philippines and a person in the UK. I think it's tricky and it needs complexifying, but I still think class analysis needs to be there. Otherwise, you get what we have, which is where if people want to stop talking about class, you can have the Tory party talking about how incredibly inclusive their front bench is without anyone batting an eyelid, because there isn't an intersection class analysis to what are the goods that this is producing, what are the material circumstances and conditions that this is reproducing. But it is a huge question, and it's one you couldn't answer in a whole book, never mind in 3 minutes. But the material and the frameworks of reproduction are the two key things for me.
Thank you so much. Look at that perfect timing, and we've managed to get most people's questions in, I think. That's been fascinating, really stimulating. I love these conversations about class because that's how I identify as well. And I find you really challenge some of my worldviews as well. So thank you so much. I do absolutely encourage folks to read the book. It's got some really deep, reflexive and interesting chapters in there. So thank you everyone for attending, for giving your questions. I'm sure we'll have Luke back again another time, maybe talking about your PhD, Luke, which is a slightly different subject, so that'd be great. And folks, do remember to look us up on the Centre for Religion in Society at York St John. We have a whole programme of events that you can dip into. It'd be lovely to see you. So thanks again to Luke. A big round of applause. Thanks, Luke. And thanks to everybody else for attending. Cheers. Take care.
Thank you very much, Sharon. It's been great to see you. Thank you.